Good morning. I'm Naomi Yanicki, and I get to talk to you about Psalms 61 through 63. And David starts out in these Psalms right away, acknowledging that he is overwhelmed and he is extremely tired, and he is in a literal wilderness in these Psalms. And when I've read through them, I think about how relatable they are to areas of our life where we can feel overwhelmed or maybe tired, or we've grown to the point where we might even feel faint, like we can barely keep going. Areas where we've lost hope, or like his physical wilderness or even desert. I think of places where we might all feel like we don't have the fruit that we want, or we feel barren, like there's nothing happening. We're waiting for something that's just not there. Or we've given up hope. And they don't have to be our entire life. They can be a part of our life, potentially our health, maybe our finances, a relationship, something we're just struggling, and we don't see any way through. We are in the wilderness. So let's look at David here. I even read a quote from a famous, Christian famous author and leader of Proverbs 31 Ministries, Lisa TerKeurst, found herself in a wilderness where her very ministry depends on helping people in their marriages. And a few years ago, her husband had an affair and left her. All of these really hard things came out, and she literally found herself in the wilderness. And then they worked through it, and then they got a divorce a year later, and she found herself in a wilderness. And just this week, she got remarried, and I saw this quote on social media that I thought was really appropriate for my psalm today. It said, "Although we face the unkindness and unfaithfulness of people, we can view our life as a continuous story rather than get stuck in isolation or in an isolated circumstance," which makes me think of the wilderness. So today, let's look at how David teaches us this idea of rebuilding trust and figuring out a way, kind of like Steve Irwin, if you ever watch those shows about exploring the wilderness. How do we survive and thrive in the wilderness? And Psalm 61 through 63 gives us this list of objects for survival. It gives us these ideas about who God is that are physical pictures, the nature of God. It lists off all of these survival ideas. Physical survival. It says that God is a refuge in all three of these Psalms, a shelter, a strong tower, a fortress, that he's water for our thirst, that he's satisfying food for our soul, that he's a literal wing for us that can carry us and bring us to places and also be present and protect us. He's a tent in our wilderness. He's a physical rock. He is a place that takes us to higher ground. I think of even flooding in the wilderness. He is a physical rock to build our life on. He is protection for us. I think about all of the elements in the wilderness, and I think I want that list. But there's areas of my life where I'm in the wilderness, and I'm reading these Psalms, and I'm like, all right, David, how do I get, I'm hooked, I'm signed up. Like, be my wilderness guide. Give me the list. I want this list. Like, take me, guide me. And then he does. In all three of these Psalms, he tells me how to find these things in my wilderness. He takes me through it as my guide. He tells me what to do. I don't really like it, but he tells me what to do. It's hard. He says, listen, you have to trust in God alone if you want these things. I'm like, okay, all right, okay. Trust in God alone. And then he tells me how he does that, what it looks like for him. He has two ways of doing that. He runs into the place of prayer. And not just prayer, but silence. This one hurts because I'm a words person. And he says, when things get extreme, be quiet. Be quiet. And he gives a very clear picture of himself in what I read a few commentaries, what's called surrendered silence. He waits in surrendered silence. And that is what literally forms these attributes of God around him. When he goes to that place of prayer and silence, not just immediately word vomiting, not just immediately blasting God, but literally going and sitting in silence, he finds that renewed trust in God. And why? I had to figure this out. I'm like, all right, David, this sounds pretty magical. So I read a few commentaries in Spurgeon's commentaries, and here's what they said. Sometimes when we're in the wilderness and in isolation, and we've done everything we can do, and we're like David, we're overwhelmed, we're faint, we're exhausted, we don't know anything else to do. When we go to a place of silence, it's because all the words have been said. And we have to sometimes wait for his word to come. And it said, sometimes the issue in our life can rest on him alone. That one's hard for me to swallow because I would like the issue to rest on Rob, or I would like the issue to rest sometimes in a friendship coffee date or with my mom on the phone. I would like the issue to rest and be easily resolved in 3 counseling sessions or 4 spiritual direction sessions, right? Let's do this. Let's figure this out, God. But sometimes it rests in him alone, because this commentary went on to say that our natural minds want reason, and we want to be in control and get traveling on our way. I want that. I want to travel on my way. I don't want to be quiet. But it also goes on to say that we have one voice after another, including our own, and these must cease. They must cease so that our soul can open up to God alone. All right, so that's your survival guide, point number 1. But good news, if you're a words person like me and you can't keep it all in, David goes on to say, and then you pour out your heart to God. And you pour it all out in a way that's described in the same commentary as this. You pour out your heart as water. You don't pour out your heart to the things of this world as milk whose color remains, as wine whose savor remains, not as honey whose taste remains, but as water. Because when it is poured out to God, nothing remains. I'm getting kind of emotional because I feel that. Because David, again, is saying, when you pour out first to God, and you don't try to pour it out in all these other places and all these other things, it's very clear. Those things aren't as satisfying and don't go as far as pouring your heart out to God. Sometimes when I pour my heart out to Rob, let me just be honest, it's not very satisfying. He wants to go to bed. Sometimes when I pour my heart out to a friend, they just don't have the capacity, and I still have all the taste of my issues in my mouth. Sometimes I pour my heart out to someone that really doesn't care, and they don't listen, and then I could grow bitter, right? And that's why it's so important to pour my heart out to God. And guess what? David says, if I do this, here's God's promise to me. He shows up. He leads me to a higher place. He shelters me. His presence surrounds me. He upholds me with his right hand. He will be my guide to follow through this desert place that I don't know how to get through. I don't know what to do. It says that the mouths of all those around me who've been potentially unkind, who've been wreaking havoc in my life, will be silenced. That he will sustain me, especially if I've run out of options, if I've run out of energy, if I've run out of the willpower or even the ability to even think another thought or live another day. He will be there to give me what I need. He will defend me. He will protect me. He will even give me a heritage. And he will provide me with life and truth, and not just preserve me on earth, but for all of eternity. That sounds great. And if you're still a little bit skeptical, he gives me an alternative, and he's like, okay, if you're not willing to do that and trust God, because it might sound too good to be true, which I understand. I am processing that too. He says, all right, If you don't want to do that, here is your alternative. He says in Psalm 63, 9 and 10, go ahead and try it. Put your trust in man. And here's what can happen. He says, go ahead and put your trust in the common man, and you're going to end up with those relationships turning into a vapor. They're going to come and go and just like dandelion dust. They're going to evaporate. And he's like, then you can find the impressive man, and you're going to end up in a lie. And then he says, if you put both the common man and the impressive man on a scale compared to God, going to put your trust in those places into man and all of their ideas and promises compared to God, it weighs nothing. And then he says, here's option 2. Go do something oppressive and hurtful. Go take what you need out of life. Take control. Go hurt someone back. Go steal what you need. Take control. Take what you need to rectify your situation. Maybe go take vengeance. Go steal. Maybe go stomp on your husband today. Steal a dream. Maybe go hurt someone at work that's hurt you. Maybe go fight for what you need and don't seek God. And he says, guess what? It's not going to work. It's going to leave you unsatisfied. And it's also important to consider option 3. He says, go ahead and put your trust in riches. That could solve all of your problems. But he says, if you set your heart on that, it also isn't going to last. I think I want to avoid failure. I don't know, but it's easier said than done. And then he ends with this idea. Not only has God said this once, but he said it twice. He said it more than that. I think David's just trying to reinforce his idea here. But he says God's power, or all power, belongs to God. So even the most powerful people, compared to God, they mean nothing. And if we're seeking for justice, especially if it's people that have broken our trust, he says this, don't worry, justice and mercy are mine. So if you're looking for vindication or right where people have wronged you, or you're in isolation and in a desert place simply because of all of the wrongs that have happened to you, like how do I trust people ever again? How do I open myself up? Or how do I even trust myself? Like I keep going back to the same bad habits, even if it's just like I can't lose the weight I want. I don't know, if it's something simple. How do I try this one more time? God says, listen, come to me because I will help you. And in the end, no matter how horrible or how simple it is, I give each one their reward for all of the wrong and all of the right. Even if you don't see justice on earth, and this one's really hard for me. This one, I'm going to be honest, it's hard for me. You will see it by the time you get to heaven. Well, let me pray for you today. These Psalms I found to be way more interesting than I thought. I'm going to be honest. I was kind of skeptical about getting on here and trying to tell you something worthwhile. But when I read them, they really spoke to me, which is why we all need to read the Psalms, because they really are a survival guide for all seasons of our life. And this is a good one for the wilderness and for isolation and for when the story isn't going the way we think and when we lose hope. But it's also good to thrive, not just survive. Let me pray for you. Jesus, thank you for the people who may have watched to the end of this video. And if they did, I pray that they would be extra blessed through this prayer, that you would give them the silence that their life needs. You'd give them the power to pull out of their lives and to find that refuge and that place, just like David did, in the midst of isolation or wilderness or struggle. You would give them the time and the place to make a date with you, to be in silence and to hear your voice and to wait on you. But you would also set up a time for them to pour out their heart to you and to learn how to trust you first and you most. And I pray that those waiting for justice and those that need mercy would have what they need, what their heart is crying out for today. In Jesus' name, amen. We'll see you later.